budget. Because there's always, you know, like if you have my school, you know, you say, well, we can't afford to have a substitute in because of this, it's costing us this much. Would that be the case? Would there be a restriction on every school, a budget, you can only, you know, you have this much to spend, I don't know, 10,000, I don't know how much, but it's just a hypothetical, 10,000, this is your budget for the year, or is it unlimited?
It's unlimited, but it's organized, and it's organized according to what I would call a triage model, which gets to your other point earlier around the expediency, right, that we apply to making decisions about kids who require the support the most, like right now, right away. So I'll just talk to the teams for a minute, then I'll come back to that whole triage idea. But there are 4 assistant superintendents, there are 4 interdisciplinary teams. On those teams, we have psych, speech paths, counselors, and instructional coordinators. Right, child and youth care workers. And the assistant superintendent is the lead case manager. Now, the model is that when the cases come to those teams, they're pretty acute. They're the top most challenging cases in that assistant superintendent's cohort of schools. As Darlene was saying, you always start with the teacher. The teacher applies interventions. If those don't work, the teacher connects to the school-based team, and that's principal, VP, if possible, the speech path assigned to the school, the psych assigned to the school, counselor. If that school-based team is not successful in their interventions, then they send off a request for consultation to the assistant superintendent's team. And that's because the case is now acute. And so those teams are standardized. The process for acquiring the support of the teams is standardized. And the teams meet regularly to review the cases and to map out interventions, including who's going to be deployed, which gets at your question around, okay, so how do you make this happen when you do have limited resources? So the teams have got to make a decision about which are the most critical cases that need to be dealt with now, and then which cases can wait for a week or two. So the urgency directs the work of the team. And then the assistant superintendent has got to work with the teams to figure out who's deployed. Often what I recommend is you never send people out alone. Often what you should try to do is pair maybe a speech path with an instructional coordinator to get a nice mix of professional views in terms of their observations when they go out into the classroom. So basically what you have to do, because you don't have unlimited resources and team members, is do this triage approach, hit the most acute cases as soon as you possibly can.
And you know, Dave mentioned earlier on that what is critical for us is that we do, because of, you know, you don't have unlimited resources. Because of that, we do have to really start by focusing in on that tier 1, doing everything we can there to make our classrooms the best learning environments and proactive for our students. So that's why how well we do our job in tier 1 really determines our capacity in the other tiers. So that's why you'll hear so much focus on those universal evidence-based practices and really enhancing the instructional work. Again, just to give you an example of some of the work that has happened in the district, we had a teacher in one of the schools I worked with, and this, I'm sure we have other instructional coordinators in the room, and they can probably give other wonderful examples too. They like it when I put them on the spot. But I was called into a classroom. A teacher said, you know, I really want to use stronger literacy circles. She wanted a more engaging experience for her students around the area of reading. She didn't want it to be, okay, everybody's reading, you're going to answer these 5 questions about the book. She wanted to move away from that. But she had 4 students in her class that she was really worried about. So she wasn't sure how they would engage in that process because they were struggling readers. It was a grade 6 classroom. So I went in and partnered with her and just did a series of assessments to sort of diagnose or identify exactly where those students were struggling, where some of those deficits were. So we could not just give them 10 less spelling words, but say, wow. And just to give you an example, 2 of those students didn't know their R-controlled vowels. Those are the IRs, ORs, URs. If you start putting that into reading as a grade 6 student, it kind of hampers your reading comprehension when you don't have that. But we partnered together to figure that out about those students. I helped her and an educational assistant design some activities to strengthen that. We also used a computer program that we're piloting. I mean, the district is really being so proactive in looking at different things that we can be doing. So we have those students using that computer program as well, not computer by itself, because I really believe in using technology to enhance the work we're doing, but it doesn't replace, it's a partner with us. So that was a part of the work. We had 2 students out of that 4, so that was kind of our tier 2 for those students. We have that support coming in for them. We had 2 students that we were really significantly concerned about. And so we designed what we kind of phrased for us, this team that we had, tier 3, and we partnered with the Aboriginal resource teacher in the district because she had some very specialized knowledge around a reading intervention. So it was an educational assistant, a classroom teacher, a student support teacher, myself, and the district resource teacher that all came alongside to design interventions. They're doing it and they're running with it. And it's not that I'm there doing the interventions, but we've partnered together. So it just kind of gives you another idea of how those teams, but that wasn't at the acute level. We didn't have to go to the LSST, this district team. It was more of a proactive, collaborative approach that happened in one of our schools. The thing about the teams is the district as a whole is organized into 4 zones. Each assistant superintendent, like Chris is the assistant superintendent for this zone. And Chris, you have 2 families of schools, right? The Cedar Zone and the Dover Bay Zone. The team I'm on, we have the Barsby and the Woodlands Zone. Lynn? Four zones, equipped every zone with the teams. So you can And see so why these are new teams this year. There's been growing pains. There always is when you try something. They've organized the district into these 4 zones, equipped every zone with the teams. And so these are new teams this year. There's been growing pains. There always is when you try something new. But it's starting to move. And we're getting referrals and we're partnering with teachers in schools. And so lots of things are occurring in this area.
Yeah, I just think you can't emphasize enough the idea that no matter what the challenge is, you always start with tier 1. You never start by thinking that the child or the student has a huge problem that will push you straight into tier 2 or tier 3. You always assume that, first off, that whatever is challenging that particular student to be successful is something that can be supported by any one of those universal strategies, whatever that might be. You start there with that assumption, and then you work your way through, if necessary, to a more clinical kind of intervention. But hopefully you can see how things are different in this model. You don't start with the clinical assessment. You don't start by making an assumption that the child has some sort of deeply rooted biological disorder that can only be mediated by some kind of an intervention from a psychologist or some other kind of a pediatrician and so on. You may need to work with those folks. I mean, you have to remember that this is a country where I think the number of boys on Ritalin now for ADHD is around 3 million. So we've got to get out of this sort of path we've been on where we assume that these problems can only be mediated by these old traditional ideas about clinical assessment, coming up with some kind of therapeutic intervention and medication if necessary. We want to avoid getting into that immediately. Sometimes medication helps, but it certainly isn't the starting point. And we want to pool the professional judgment of our staff in connection with our students so that they come up with the best interventions imaginable right off the hop at the tier 1 level. And if for whatever reason those don't succeed, then you head on up to tier 2 and tier 3. But what we're finding is you rarely need to get out of tier 1. It's a huge cultural shift for any school system to go from the model of clinicians working alone with children and deciding on what their pathology is, to teams working with kids and assuming that they are human beings of high value who have a couple of challenges that likely can be mediated with the right kind of intervention at the Tier 1 level in the classroom. And I can tell you that a lot of those interventions, again, are not all that complicated. And so helping people understand what they look like is where we're at right now. But again, they're not overly complex.
And Dave brought up a good point. Those young men that I mentioned that we're working with, we already had a teacher there that had a spin bike in the back of her classroom. So those students already had that opportunity. She was already very forward thinking in these other pieces, but for whatever reason, they were in grade 6 with these deficits. So we were looking at, they stayed in the classroom. They weren't pulled out. They weren't pulled out of those reading projects. They were a part of them. So we also designed supports to allow them to access it, while we also looked at accelerating their learning. So there were multiple pieces that came in to come in alongside those young men and support them. So it was a great process to be a part of. So thinking about that Tier 2, it could include some small group targeted proactive supports as much as possible, and I know we say that a lot, but in the classrooms, because we know that pulling kids out isn't the most effective way in supporting their needs. Could include both reading comprehension, social emotional. Those are those beginning places we're starting in. First, we want to make sure our students are engaged and ready to learn. And then we want to make sure that our instruction is really based on the most effective evidence-based models that we have. So I'd like to highlight, we talked about that the most important things that we do in schools. And as much as I love technology and 21st century learning, I could tell you stories of how I had 6-year-olds engaged in those project-based learning experiences that you're looking at Dover. So I'm excited to see that growing here. But I love this. It says it's called Reading. It's how people install new software. So it's just that reminder that is one of the really important things we do. And when students struggle there, we need to have intervention supports for them. But also, if we have students that feel like they're being glued to their seats, it's not about them eating enough paste, but us making sure that our classrooms are reflective of those learning environments and experience that we're talking about, that it's not about them being glued to their seats. That's not how we know our students are engaged metacognitively in the work that we're doing.
So you've mentioned a few times classroom environment and bringing in different types of seating and different stuff like that, and I understand there's also the model classroom at Seaview, which is very low-key, only colors from nature, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a motion with the classroom environment being a big part of Tier 1 to change how classrooms look, particularly in primary grades, which tend to be busy, lots of color? Is that something that, like I understand schools have gone and seen the classroom, is it up to the teachers to then adopt those ideas? Or is there a push from the teams or from the district to use, to standardize and make those changes to support, the work that's happening here?
I think before we turn over to Dave to answer that, I think we're going to get a plug for your next session, I think.
Yes, and also an invite for you and for everyone here, actually. We have a district secondary self-regulation room started here at Dover as well. And so we could show you that afterwards. Everyone who wants to come and have a look at it. I know after last session, we did walk through that area, and we also walked down to our 21st Century Learning Center that we have that we're developing too. It's about enhancing facilities for learning. That's a key. That's one of our strategic goals. And so that's what our focus is going to be here. Every opportunity that we get to be able to show people, if they don't get it, well, we want to say, well, this is kind of what it looks like. And so in these areas, we want to be able to show people some examples of what we might be able to bring back into every classroom.